Hi everyone, BritSimon here. So this is going to be a part 2 video to a video I created earlier regarding the chances of selection for anybody entering the lottery. This information that I want to give now is going to be quite a bit more detailed than that previous video because there are some concepts that I think are useful to understand and you may not understand yet. I was in conversation with a gentleman called Sam in one of the Telegram channels, and there was a topic of conversation amongst people about Ethiopia. And there was a suggestion made that Ethiopia has all of its selectees concentrated in the earlier number ranges. Someone mentioned up to 30,000, which sounds a bit far-fetched, but let's say 40,000. And I said that's perfectly possible, and I'll explain how that's possible and why it happens in some years, and exactly why it will happen. It probably has happened in this year. So buckle up, be prepared to sort of learn some stuff. Go get a cup of tea or a coffee or something, because this is going to take a few minutes, and we'll cover some data in fair amount of detail. So firstly, let me show you here where we're going to be taking some data from. If you Google DV lottery statistics, you get to this page, and in here there is sort of 3 sections of data that are very useful. The first is the number of online entries received each year, and they arrange those in batches of 3 years in a PDF document. I'll show you that in a moment. You can see that we don't have the data from 22 to 24 yet. I'm expecting that to be released quite soon. They recently added this line as if they're going to turn that into a link and release the data. So I'm looking forward to seeing that data. But we'll look instead at the most available, or the most recent available data, which will be 2019 to 2021. And I'm going to focus on 2019, actually. Mainly, I'm going to use Africa 2019 to explain the concepts. Okay, so that's section 1. Section 2 has the number of selected entrants for recent programs, and basically what you see in section 2 is very similar to what we see in the visa bulletin. It's almost identical. It's a straight lift from that. So it has the number of selected people, selectees per country in that particular year, and a little bit of information about that year. We can see in this year, by the way, there were 14 million qualified entries with 22 million with derivatives in that year. And in that year, they selected only 87,610 applicants, which is way lower than recent years where they've selected 143,000 in DV 2024 and 131,000 at least in DV 2025. So this was a low selection year, which was kind of interesting. Anyway, this is information that you would have, and obviously, if you were to look at today's visa bulletin, the one that's in force right now, you could come along and see that at any time. But if you look at the September one, September 24, that's the visa bulletin that has all of that results information for DV 2025. Okay, so if you wanted to see current information and how we got to 131,000 selectees, then you can come here and see that. Okay. All right. So and then going back to our DV lottery statistics. So section 1 is about the number of entries. Section 2 deals with the number of selectees, and section 3 has the number of people awarded visas either by consular processing or adjustment of status in each of the years, in this case, from 2008 to 2017 there. And I think, where is the other one? No, they've just got the old form. It's quite interesting. They say it's from 2013 to 2022, but actually they've got the wrong form there. Bless them. Yeah, so it's older data, but we also have that data. You can get that from the yearbooks, but I'm not going to be looking at that data today. I'm going to be showing you data from 2019, from this section and from this page here. So let me show you the data from the number of entries. This is 2019. There are 3 columns for 2019, 3 columns for 2020, and 3 columns for 2021, giving the number of entries, the number of derivatives additionally that are on those entries, and the total, therefore, per country. So Algeria, for example, had 227K entries in 2019. They had 123K derivatives, dependents, spouses and children on those cases, the 227K, and that was a total of 350,000 people. And you can see that if we just scroll down the Africa section here, you can see they've got all sorts of numbers for the various countries on how many entries they received, right? Now, there is a direct correlation between the number of entries received and the number of selectees chosen. There's a direct correlation. If we, for example, if we take Algeria at 227,000 entries, and we take Cameroon at 310,000 entries, we would expect there to be more selectees from Cameroon than there would be from Algeria. And if we take a very small country like Botswana that only has 518 entries, we would expect that to be much, much less in terms of the number of winners than the other 2 countries that I just mentioned, Algeria and Cameroon. Is that actually the case? Let's have a look at that. Let me close this one. We'll have a look at the selected entrants. So Algeria in that year got 2,462. Cameroon got 2,978. So it is appreciably larger, about 500 extra selectees, which ties in quite nicely with 227,000 entries for Algeria compared to their 2,400 selectees, and also ties in with the 310,000 that Cameroon had with their number of selectees. Okay, and you can see that Botswana only had 3 selectees from the 518 entries that it received. Okay, so there is a correlation here, and that correlation is really supposed to be, legally, it's supposed to be exactly the same chance of selection in any country within a region, within a single region. Africa will have a different chance of selection than Asia, which will be different to Europe and so on. But within the region of Africa, all the countries within that region should have the same chance of selection, right? So what I want to do is see if that statement follows through and whether it really is borne out by the data or not. And there actually is some anomalies, and I can explain those anomalies. So have a look at that data. By all means, come and have a look at that data for yourself and have a look at that. But what I've done is I've pulled that data into a spreadsheet, and I've added some additional calculated columns to this data. First of all, I moved the data for 2020 and 2021. I moved that to the right. I added some more columns, so that data is there, but it's to the right. I've got Algeria 227K entries. I've got Cameroon 310K entries, and Botswana 580. Right? I've got all of the entries. I haven't talked much about the derivatives, but it's the entries that represent your chance of selection, not the number of derivatives on those entries. And so I focus more on the number of entrants. Okay, but the numbers that we see here, the 2,462, that's actually entries, or is selectees for principal winners and the derivatives. It's mixed in there. So if I need to try and figure out how many actual cases each one of those countries had, as opposed to the number of selectees, which includes family members, derivatives, I have to go and understand. I have to understand roughly what's their derivative rate, which varies by country. Okay, so that's one of the first things I've calculated in this spreadsheet here. I've looked at the number of entries, the derivatives, and the total of those two columns added to this column, and I've calculated the derivative rate for each of the countries, and you can see it varies quite greatly. So Algeria has a derivative rate of 1.54, and Angola has 2.44. So almost a full derivative more, right? What that means is for each one of these entries, there would be 1.54 people on average on each of those cases, and so you could multiply 227,000 times the 1.54, and you'll come up with the 350,000. And I got that simply by doing some math between those columns, right? So I then said, okay, and I've done that for all of the countries there in that list for Africa. I've then said, okay, what's the percentage of entries? How many of the total number of entries for Africa in this year? There were 7.8 million entries in Africa in that year. And of that, Algeria had 227,000 of the entries, which represents 2.9% of the overall number of entries compared to the 7.8 million, right? I'm hoping that's making sense to you. So you can see that some countries have less selectees or less entries, and therefore will have less selectees. That's probably the first main point you should have understood by now. So you can see the percentage number of entries, like how many entries did they put in there. And there are some startling numbers in there. Like if I scroll down to Ghana, Ghana had 2 million entries, which is 25% of every entry in Africa. A ridiculous number of entries, frankly. There's other countries here, like Sierra Leone had over 1 million entries, which is 12.84% of all of the entries in Africa in DV 2019. So there were 14 million entries globally, 7.8 million in Africa alone, and 2 million of those entries were from one country, Ghana. That's already an anomaly, and we need to talk about what the impact of that is and how that affects the process. But let me just explain the rest of these columns to you briefly. I've taken the number of selectees from the other form, the Section 2 form, so I've plotted that against each of the countries so we have that data. And then using some math and the derivative rate, I've said, okay, apply that derivative rate to the number of selectees. How many cases does that mean they have? And that's allowed me to then calculate the percentage of the winning cases. So in other words, we know there are 27,500 cases approximately based on this math. And of that, 1,594, which is Algeria's predicted number of mathematically computed number of cases based on the derivative rate and the selectee number, etc. That's 5.79% of that 27,500 figure, okay? And since we now know the number of cases that were selected, we can also see what the chance of selection per case was for that particular country in that particular year. So Algeria had a 0.7% chance of selection in that year. Now remember, it was a low selection year, which is good and bad. It means that the chance of selection is fairly low. It was below 1% in that year, as an average across all of the countries in the region. But on the other hand, everybody that was selected had a very good chance of going through and getting a visa, as opposed to the DV 24 and 25 reality, where some people are left without even an interview. Okay, so there's swings and roundabouts, pros and cons, as to which sort of year you get involved with, right? Okay, so now you understand the columns that I've added, and you can do the same thing. You can download this data from the source I've shown you, and you can calculate all these same numbers if you like. It doesn't take very long at all, right? Now let's talk about the draw process and how things would work to cause the sort of effect that Sam had mentioned about Ethiopia today, right? So there's some things that we should understand. I've said that the chance for every country within the region should be the same, but the chance for every country does not look the same here. Why not? Well, there's a couple of reasons. Firstly, there are some limited countries, and I'll talk about those in a minute. And secondly, there are different behaviors of entries within different countries. So we know that one of the biggest ways that you can get disqualified between the December draw and the May announcement of the results, one of the biggest ways you can get disqualified before you even find out that you're a winner is based on the photos, right? So if you're from a country where the economy is bad, maybe there are no professional photographers, or there are very few, they're hard to get to. Maybe the standard of the phones is not very good. Maybe the internet's not very good in that country. There could be several factors that could make it difficult for someone to take a photo of the necessary quality to enter the lottery successfully. And in that case, lots of those people from that country will be knocked out during the draw process. And we could see a normal country, non-limited in any way, but having less selectees because of that phenomenon, that they just lose more of their cases. There could also be a situation where a country could be rife with fraud, people doing multiple entries and that sort of thing. And again, that will lead to a low percentage chance of selection on this list here. That would lead to it. But let me just sort of draw your attention to some of these very large countries, right? Ghana had 2 million entries, which means their chance of selection was 0.11%, staggeringly low. Why is it so low? So why did they only get 2,221 selectees? Sorry, 2,484 selectees from over 2 million entries. And the reason for that really is because that country was limited during the draw. So what do I mean by limited? Let's say you followed the other video I made today, which describes the draw process and says, okay, every entry will get a number between 1 and 8 million in Africa, let's say. I mean, 10 million or 7 million, whatever number it means. And the top 100,000 numbers, which have been randomly ordered, by the way. So the top 100,000, based on the numbers, would be the winners, right? The winners that they start with. And then they start kicking out those winners for photos and for fraudulent entries and that sort of thing. But they also go through that draw process and they start to realize where the winners come from. And at some point during the draw process, working from number 1 going on down, they reach a numerical limit, which they set arbitrarily, that says no country should have more than, in DV 2019, it was 4,185 selectees, thereabout. That's selectees including family members. Or they might have said no country will have more than X number of cases, 2,800 cases, something in that range, right? And so there are sort of 2 ways that they would limit things. And for a country like Ghana, if Ghana had 25% of the entries, as it does, it means that every 4th entry would be a Ghanaian, as they're drawing from that 1 to 100,000 number. And that's simply unworkable. That would lead to thousands and thousands of Ghanaians being selected. And quite simply, there's no point in doing that, right? And so to be fair to the other countries, and also to not swamp the embassies with 10,000 Ghanaians going to Accra or something, they artificially limit those countries during the draw after some given point, starting from number 1 and working down towards 100,000. And so because that country gets limited at some point like that, all of its selectees that are left after it's been limited and after the results have been announced are always in the earlier number ranges. Okay, and you can see this actually in any year. It becomes very easy to see this. Let me just show you Zarthisius's site. If we look at some of the data and we just look at it visually, we can see that it's not quite so clear let's have a look at 2019. We can see that there's a reducing number of selectees or an increasing number of holes, right? It's a reducing number of density or density number essentially, but it doesn't happen sort of gradually. It actually happens in cliffs. So I can look at that and I can say, okay, above, when we started the draw, it looks like about 65 to 67% of the cases were actual cases, and the other 33% or so was holes, right? And you can see that up until about case number 20,000. At 20,000, there's a sudden drop in that number. So it goes just under 60% at that time. And the holes is about 40% in that range, right? And so that has been where a country has been limited. And so there's now a different density number going forward. Then that other country also gets limited around about 24,000, it looks like, and there's another cliff. And we drop off a cliff and we're at a new level now, where the holes are at 49%. So there's basically 50% of the cases going forward until we hit another cliff, another country that's being limited during the draw. And later on, there's another cliff as well. So there are at least 4 cliffs in DV 2029, meaning 4 countries which were artificially limited during the draw. And that's why we see density reductions. You can see it very, very clearly in different regions, by the way. If we look at Asia, let's have a look, different year, and 24 is probably a good year to look at for Asia. If we look at Asia, you can see the cliff is much more pronounced in Asia. So that first section of cases includes Nepal. Then Nepal gets no further cases, no further selectees above 13,000. They're just stop dead. And so we then have a lower density rate until Iran is also stopped at about 22,000 in DV 2024. And so we go to a different density for the rest of Asia. It continues that way. So you can see that this is a much more obvious representation of the cliff drops that I'm talking about, but these are essentially the same reason. This is where countries are limited. And so in Asia in DV 2024, there were case numbers up to 44,000, but there were no Nepalese cases above 13,000. They were all in that first 13,000 range, and all of the Iranian cases were in the first 22,000. And that's the exact same effect that can happen in other regions. Only in the 3 big regions. This only happens in Asia, Africa, and Europe. And if we look at Oceania and South America, you can see the density is more or less, although it's up and down every 100 cases, it's basically uniform. It's the same level of density all the way through. And same thing for South America. There are no cliff countries, no limited countries in South America and Oceania. So what makes the cliff countries? Well, as we saw, it was an overwhelming, disparate number of entries from certain countries. And I've highlighted the 4 countries that I think were the 4 cliffs in DV 2019. Ghana, Ethiopia, Egypt, and Congo-Kinshasa, which had, each one of them had over 1 million people involved in the lottery, including derivatives. And they got different percentages, and I could go into a little bit more detail about the different percentages in terms of winners. But you can see, particularly in the case of Ghana, it's very obvious that 25% of the entries only yielding 8% of the actual winning cases. That means a lot of them were stopped. And therefore, and the more that were stopped, the earlier that cutoff would be. So Ghana would have been probably the first cliff that we saw on the DV 2019 data. Okay. Now, with something as weird as the number of selectees at Ghana, the number of selected cases for other countries in that region would have gone higher, because the percentage splits here in the number of entries doesn't tie very well with the number of cases selected, and that's because of the effect of Ghana being such an incredible part of the number of entries. Having over a quarter of the entries for one country is weird, obviously, and that causes a problem. Now, there is also the aspect of fraud and bad photos at work here. It's not solely the limited countries. And we can also see cultural behavior from year to year as well, which changes. There'll be some years when a country has a lot of entries, and then perhaps in the next year they don't have so many entries. Why is that? Well, it could be a localized war, it could be localized economic problems or whatever. And the problems could either increase or decrease the desire and ability of people to enter the lottery, and therefore affect how each year goes from year to year. The mix of entries within the region could be different a little bit. Okay. One thing I would also point out, by the way, is that the numbers we see here, the 7.8 million entries we saw in DV 2019, wasn't repeated for very long. In 2020, there was about 8 million entries. But then in 2021, there was only about 4 million people, 4.8 million people. So only about 3 million entries. And the reasoning for that in 2021 was the passport rule. That's when the passport became required to actually enter the lottery. And the passport rule had a particularly damaging effect to Ghana, because you can see that their number of entries went from the 2 million in 2019 to 1.9 million in 2020. And then in 2021, they only had 298,000. And that's indicative of how powerful it is to require a passport in order to enter the lottery. That rule has now been taken away, of course. It was taken away in 2022. So the numbers of entries has gone up again. But it does show that if you looked at Ghana entries and you saw their derivative rate, it would be much different with and without the passport rule, because the passport rule enforces real entries, whereas without that rule, you can have fake entries. And actually, in certain countries such as Ghana, there were a lot of fake entries, and you can partially tell that by the number of derivatives on those cases, because fake entries typically are missing the family members. Okay, so there you go. That's given you some data to think about, and hopefully I've made it clear why some countries are limited during the draw, and I've given you some food for thought in terms of the percentage chances of being selected. It is, as I mentioned on the video earlier, it's about 1 in 100 chance of selection, a higher chance of selection in Oceania, and it varies year to year. Your chance of selection will be better in a year when they over-select, but then your chance of getting issued will be lower. And in years where there's less entries, your chance of selection could be higher, because they haven't necessarily related the number of entries to the number of selectees. It's not how it works. And so you have some years where you have a low number of selectees, and that's a good thing for everybody. But there could be a high number, high number of entries. So high number of entries, but a low number of selectees. That would be a very difficult year to get selected in, but you'd have a very good chance of getting your visa at any number, because your case number wouldn't be high at all. it would be quite different to what we've been experiencing recently. Okay, I think that should cover it. If you have any questions, please let me know. Be particularly interested to hear what Sam thinks of the presentation and whether this has made anything clearer to him. Hopefully I've covered everything. I unfortunately had to re-record this video. I did 2 videos earlier on today, and neither one of them had good enough quality to be able to publish. So I've had to redo the video. So I've probably left off some information from the second run. So I apologize for that. But hopefully I've given you a good flavor of the information so that you can understand the subject better. All right, everybody, please do subscribe to the channel. Give me a thumbs up if you like this particular video, and let me know if you've got any questions. I'd be interested to hear what questions you have. You can always ask questions at BritSimonSays.com, or you can ask questions on the YouTube or in the Telegram channels if you'd prefer that. All right, thanks everyone. Bye-bye now.